So a bit about Dr. Masutha. Mukovhe Masutha is the director for the Center of Emerging Researchers and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Johannesburg under the SAChi Chair in Teaching and Learning. He holds a BA and a BSc from Wits University, an MSc from UJ, and a PhD in Higher Education Policy and Management from the University of Bath. His research interests include higher education funding, Black working class student experiences and outcomes in higher education, critical race theory, social reproduction in education and society, national security and public policy making, the public policy making cycle. He is a former chairperson of the South African Students' Congress and Student Representative Council at Wits University. He's currently between Canada and here. So it is an extremely early good morning to him. But I will then hand over to him to share his presentation with us. And then I will introduce the two discussants, Dr. Otilia Chiramba and Dr. Zahra MacDonald, who are also doctoral fellows with the SAChi Chair. There is one other SAChi Chair doctoral fellow present today, and that is Dr. Cindy Msumingo, and you're also very welcome here today. Thank you. Dr. Masutha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I will just quickly share my presentation before you start my clock. I don't know if that is,
Yes.
Are you able to view it?
Thanks very much. We can view it and it's visible.
Okay. Well, thank you very much and good afternoon to everyone. On this eve of the 45th anniversary of June 16, let me begin by honoring the class of 76 as Prof has done. This paper is titled Stories from the Margins, precisely to unmute and amplify voices of the unheard and to contribute towards our understanding of Black working class students and their survival apparatus in higher education institutions. And as Prof indicated earlier, as an early career researcher, I also want to begin by honoring Professor Michael Cross and to thank him for paving the way for us. But as a way of background, I would like to begin by locating Black working class students within the context of a South Africa that was based on systemic exclusion and exploitation of communities from which these students come from. And in 1986, 10 years after June 1976, Professor Cross wrote, "The origins of the present segregated schooling system are bound up with the structuring of South African racial capitalism." And by racial capitalism, one is really referring to Cedric Johnson's way of understanding the role racism plays in enabling key moments of capitalist exploitation. These are moments that mainly entrench and normalize pain, waste of human potential, and the dispossession of the marginalized. It is this idea that capital can only really be capital when it is accumulating. And it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality amongst people. In other words, racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires in order to prosper. And in the words of Gaji Bhattacharya, capitalism cannot function if we are all allowed to become fully human, and because the accumulation of wealth for some requires the exploitation of life for others. So Professor Cross was really alerting us as far back as 35 years ago to the historical and current ways in which systems of class and racial domination are produced and reproduced through educational institutions. And of course, 35 years later, our universities are part of what is essentially the most unequal country in the world. However, much has changed since then. Due to financial aid, a lot of Black working class students have gained access to higher education to an extent of outnumbering their white counterparts, even in some traditionally white-only universities. This has led some vice chancellors and some in government to often point to this demographic shakeup and multiracial campuses as evidence of a transforming sector. Unfortunately, the rise in access of NSFAS-funded working class students has occurred alongside a very high non-completion rate and a very low completion rate. And this is where my research comes in. Now, my interest really is on experiences of completion and non-completion amongst this group of students, and particularly how their experiences are understood and represented in scholarship and policy-making cycles. And as a working class graduate myself, I'm intrigued by how dominant forces in these cycles tend to construct grand narratives that often do not align with our lived experiences and instead serve to account and justify persistent class and racial disparities. So there are two gaps really I'll attempt to address in this presentation. The first one is that research into the higher education attainment gap has mainly framed this group of students through a flawed deficit lens, specifically among scholars who employ Bourdieu's theoretical tools. Being born to a working class family is mostly theorized as a constraint. Working class graduates are therefore largely considered an exception to the dropout norm. And this disproportionate focus on what they lack has then fed to feelings of inadequacy and illegitimacy, leading some amongst this group of students to view their failure as inevitable. The second gap I'll attempt to address is that not enough attention has been paid to the voice or narratives from the working class margins. And because of the reproductive outlook on this group of students, many have perpetuated a trend to treat them as a group that needs to be filled up with dominant forms of cultural capital, a process that of course involves removing them from familial and social context in order to acculturate them into the university, what Sarah O'Shea calls the manufacturing of sameness. Of course, such an approach not only reduces failure and success to the individual merit or the individual student's merit, but it also exonerates the higher education sector or universities from any contribution in the often classed and racialized patterns of attainment. So to move away from that deficit outlook, I set out to make sense of the institutional context in which these students are expected to aspire, navigate, and even succeed. And I seek to achieve this through a narrative lens of NSFAS-funded graduates, dropouts, academic, and support staff at 3 different universities. And to crystallize where I'm coming from, guided by Jackson and Moore, I set out to examine what is wrong with South African universities in their relation and interaction with Black working class students, rather than examining what is wrong with Black working class students in their interaction with South African universities. I do so because Carmen Mills reminds us that by looking beyond what students lack or possess, we not only reassert a place for context in our understanding of this attainment gap, but we also minimize the decontextualization of educational research. I won't go, because of time limitations, I won't detail the whole methodology, but just to stress that Gloria Larson-Billings also reminds us that we often have plenty of verifiable facts about the extent of racial and class disparities in education, but very little in the way of connecting or in the way of context, the context in which we can make real sense of those facts and statistics. Now, as I said above, the theoretical framework is mainly inspired by the work of Pierre Bourdieu and his reproduction theory, which is made out of multiple theoretical tools, but specifically the idea of field, capital, and habitus. So Bourdieu's theory suggests that by theorizing and awarding those who are already in possession of elite cultural capital as academically talented, our institutions act as a relay that reproduces principles of social class and other forms of domination under the cloak or pretense of academic neutrality. And by unmasking how cultural capital operates in education, he offers us a set of tools to challenge the justificatory ideology which enables the privileged classes to see their success as confirmation of natural or personal gifts. He therefore enables us to see how it is that something as a public good like education can manage to reproduce advantages for the already privileged and disadvantages for the marginalized. However, many of those who have employed Bourdieu's theoretical tools tend to use them to explain why the working class fail. And as I said, I shift that focus to how this group of students navigate higher education institutions that were traditionally created to exclude them. I also borrow from the work of Derek Bell, a critical race theorist, but specifically his idea of interest convergence, which suggests that Black people will experience gains when their interests converge and not infringe on the interests of those in power. Often, of course, without putting much in place to ensure that there is systemic change that occurs when those interests no longer converge. Now, again, due to time, let's then rush straight to the main themes that then emerge, not out of the data, but out of my interaction with the data itself. The first one is that in South Africa today, traditionally white universities have maintained their status as highly sought after ivory towers, while traditionally Black universities maintain their subordinate status. So the traditionally white universities not only take the lion's share of the higher education budget, they are also in possession of an inherited symbolic status that sustains and entrenches their privilege. Now, the unequal distribution of resources between these two types of universities was best illustrated by one of the academic staff that I interviewed, who narrates how their students in traditionally Black universities are not getting the best out of the universities because of apartheid era style underfunding of that group of universities. So he says, for example, I go to class to teach and I've prepared some slides to show some students, to show them a short movie, a short cartoon, maybe to bring home a principle. I get there and the plugs are not working. I call maintenance and nobody picks up on, the phone. For me, if a teacher cannot teach, that should be an emergency. But nobody shows up, you know. This leads to students not getting the best out of the university. And let's assume they have deficiencies. Let's assume they lack something upon arrival. They are here for us to form them up. And his views are echoed by a graduate student or another working class graduate at the same university who called out these massive differences, infrastructural differences between the two groups of universities. She recalled how it was not uncommon in a campus of about 16,000 students to find only one functional printer at the university. And another graduate said for him, in order to get to campus without risking his safety, he had to become a squatter, something which is very common amongst traditionally Black universities that remain grossly under resourced. It was therefore not a surprise to me that almost all graduates I interacted with in the traditionally Black universities had picked that university as their second, if not third, preferred institution, and only ended up there after being rejected by traditionally white universities. Now, the second thing to stress in this, along this line of unequal learning context is that increased racial diversity in student population has not been accompanied by increased class diversity in the type of university that can be accessed. So behind the veil of the demographic shakeup I spoke about, Black working class students remain grossly underrepresented in traditionally white universities. If we use financial aid as a proxy for working classness, given that almost 100% of NSFAS students are from Black communities, they remain a minority in traditionally white universities and a majority in lower status traditionally Black universities. And this trend repeats itself in graduation rates. NSFAS funded graduates are an absolute minority in traditionally white ivory towers and an absolute majority, almost exclusively, in some Black universities. Now, those are statistical backgrounds that I thought are also worth mentioning. But what really stood out for me is how graduates academic and support staff narrated how universities were alienating to Black working class students in ways that are often taken for granted. One professor singled out specifically the perceived universality of language and certain styles of communication to all students as an example of this alienation. And she says, for example, there was a reading I prescribed to my students, and for me, it was such a basic reading. It should have been accessible to everyone. What I took for granted was that in the reading, the author tends to speak through metaphors. And again, it was metaphors that I took for granted. But if you are not from a culture that engages those metaphors, it's multiple layers of access that you need just to engage the reading. So for me, that's why I'm saying the alienation cuts across different levels that we often take for granted. It builds up and it leads to students disconnecting and slowly beginning to disidentify. And this was also echoed at a different traditionally white university by a Black professor who said it is important for students to have somebody they look up to who looks like them. I'll give you an example. When I was at Ivory Tower University, which is one of the traditionally white universities, all Black students would come to me in engineering when they had a problem. And by the way, since I left, they have not replaced me with another Black South African professor. And secondly, do our professors actually take it as their role to be able to give confidence to their students? I think we are untransformed, unkind, and quite harsh on our students. And graduates at traditionally white universities narrated encounters with academic staff who they deemed simply out of touch with the reality of Black working class students they teach. And they pointed at that as an example of the alienation taking place, often in silence. And a specific graduate by the pseudonym Martin told of academic staff who appeared to pride themselves in making students' life miserable. The second last theme is this illusion of transformation. And now, in this case, participants felt that universities were not necessarily transforming, but window dressing, behind which lies practices, cultures, and interpersonal interactions that hinder these groups' prospects and odds of completion. One such practice is pushed dropouts. Now, around international literature, when they speak about dropouts, they mainly referring to voluntary withdrawal or students who choose to go to work or choose to travel instead of studying. But by pushed dropouts, we are referring here in South Africa to situations that occur when the university or the faculty unilaterally decides to discontinue or deregister a student due to what they call poor performance. And this is what participants had to say about it, both students and academic/support staff. One felt it was simply symbolic violence that results in real violence. She says, for me, pushed dropouts presupposes certain things. It presupposes that this person is not teachable. That is the bottom line. And the question becomes, who is not teachable? It presupposes that we have done everything that we can do as an institution to teach this person. And when have we ever done that? But funny enough, even this exclusion thing is violence. That's it. It's symbolic violence that results in real violence because you are conferring an identity on this person that you are not teachable. I mean, conferring that identity, you are sentencing them to something that is a life where they are not able to meet the demands of the market society or the racially capitalist society that Cross referred to earlier. Another academic said, yes, we are not transforming, we are window dressing. I mean, we've jumped on the bandwagon of decolonization and whatnot, but the way we have done it is that we are starting with the assumption that the foundation is not the problem. Audre Lorde says you cannot rebuild the house with the master's tools. You need new tools. And what transformation looks like now is that we are trying to rebuild with the same tools. And a member of support staff, however, was a bit more optimistic. She said, I think they are transforming just very slowly. And I think they are doing it also, in my personal view, just to meet certain quotas. At traditionally Black university, the idea that higher education was transforming was particularly dismissed as illusionary. And they point at the challenge of overcrowding to stress how apartheid era under gross underfunding of their universities persist today. And one of them said, a lecture theater which accommodates 60. We end up with 140 students. It's a crisis. I mean, you can't even hear the lecturer. You can't see the lecturer. You can't see when the lecturer is writing on the board. What do you expect from that child? And of course, as a researcher, I walked around that particular campus and saw this for myself. The last theme, due to finding, is dedicated. It's probably the most important theme in this presentation, which speaks to Black working class graduates' narratives of their survival apparatus within these institutions and across these particular institutions. So to start off is that they don't arrive on campus empty-handed. Their pathways to successful completion is paved with durable community cultural capital. A transformative...
I think you must move the slide. I think you're one slide behind.
Oh, that's correct. Thank you, Prof. That is correct. This is the second last slide. I thought we should talk more than read from the screen. Thank you very much for that, Prof. The second last slide is dealing with probably the most important theme to come out of this presentation, which, as I said, deals with the survival apparatus of this group of students in higher education, which is really a glimmer of something positive that is taking place in our universities, at least from the perspective of working class students' journeys in and through our institutions. And to ground this, Tara also explains how Black working class students, mainly writing from the American perspective, bring to higher education a host of aspirational capital, that is, hopes and dreams for the future in the face of real or perceived barriers, and navigational capital, that is, the tools necessary to maneuver through a hostile social institution that was not created with communities of color in mind. Now, the presence of both aspirational and navigational capital was particularly reflected in Risuna's story, in which he identified his ability to learn and understand independently from lecturers as what helped him survive. A transformative habitus simply refers to dispositions that, even though many perceive these students to be a fish out of water when they arrive, the findings from this study suggest otherwise, that even though they confront disabling conditions, they are able to consider those conditions as less of an obstacle and more of a challenge worth taking. I've got only 5 minutes remaining, if not less. So I would like to quickly talk about something called agents of transformation and capital accumulation before I go to my conclusive statements. Now, the issue of agents of transformation was another important enabling factor which universities can probably replicate. Now, what agents of transformations are, according to Carmen Mills at least, these are academic and support staff who facilitate the accumulation of idealized forms of capital, which multiplies students' chances of success. And this was particularly visible in one of the students who was adopted by one of the lecturers. What happened here is that the lecturer adopts the student and helps the student to find accommodation. And through interactions, in his interaction with that particular family, Tabang talks of improved language skills by listening and participating in conversations, which improved his English proficiency, or language proficiency rather. And the language proficiency in turn improved his academic engagement in class and the new social capital, and he believes propelled him to the finish line. I'm racing through that story. It's quite potent precisely because of time. So in conclusion, what does this study suggest? Well, participants' narratives firstly suggest that our renewed pursuit for transformation and justice ought to move beyond the veil of diversity policies towards transforming institutions themselves and Black people's experiences, or working class people's experiences in them. Secondly, transformation, we need to transform institutional levers of exclusion, not transform the students into ideal students, as that is what Sarah O'Shea calls the manufacturing of sameness, which actually reproduces the subordination of the working class. We need to stop judging, or rather punishing birds by their inability to swim, because by so doing, we have simply moved from de jure exclusion during apartheid, which is exclusion by law, to de facto exclusion, which is exclusion in fact in post-apartheid South Africa. Second, lastly, as interests merely converge, that is, as Black working class students merely access the panacea that is higher education, and universities' interests, that is subsidy, tuition, image, equality quotas, and so on, the subordination of Black working class students persists to the detriment of real transformation. And so this research is important, not just for scholarly purposes, but to learners who are in high school and they are approaching higher education, at least for them to have an expectation of what universities currently look like, and to better prepare themselves and hopefully even realign their expectation. So I close with a quote from one of the participants, given that this is a narrative study. The Black academic at a traditionally white university said, "I think we reward the wrong things sometimes. So our assessments need to change, I think. Our engagements need to change. I think we also need to be careful about the values that are in our curriculum, the unspoken values in the curriculum that we often take for granted. I think even when we assess students, we're not just assessing how much they've memorized the content, we're assessing how well they are able to produce it in the language that we want. I think we take for granted that our pedagogy is not just about the readings that we prescribe. Our pedagogy is the values that we also promote. This should obviously then help us rethink what we mean by access, and of course, what we mean or think is success. I'll pause there, Prof, and thanks for being very generous with an extra minute or so. I think you're still muted, Prof.
Mute. Thanks very much. You were right on time.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I tried to
5 minutes, but you did very well. Thanks very much for all right. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Mukovhe, but before I do that, yeah, so I just want to say for those who, there are lots of people who we know here, and thanks to the colleagues from UJ, Thea, Kirti, many others who've joined, to Naren Bejnath, Salim Badat, Aslam Fatah, Susie Graham, and many others who are here, Rajani Naidoo from Bath, thanks, and all the others who are here. I'm going to just add one question, Mukovhe, before you start, which comes from Prof Naren Bejnath, formerly of the SAChi. He says, your analysis is totally on point and resonant with both the decolonization and the social justice agendas. Most persuasive is your characterization of the deficit master narrative and how it reproduces inequality. My question is, how do you frame the possible complicity of universities in reproducing the conditions of inequality? Moreover, what do they need to transform systematically to be more progressive? And I think this also adds to the question that that Ottilia raised right at the end, that what are there any proposals or suggestions from a policy perspective for sort of meaningful change? I'm just going to give you a few minutes, if you don't mind, because then we need to open up for discussion and let others have their say and ask you questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I want to begin by thanking both discussants and the questions that have been asked. I'm also particularly privileged and inspired by the level of attendance, both here and outside on Facebook. Just to say thank you to everyone, because by seminar standards, this is like rock star concert. So thank you. I feel very privileged that you are here. All the questions and the comments were particularly enriching. And so I want to start by apologizing to Ottilia that the word limits when you're writing these chapters, particularly for edited books, prevent us from putting as much details as we would have wanted to. So a lot of the things that you raised are, unfortunately, I sent the full doctorate to Zara, but not to you. because I think if I had done so as well, then some of them wouldn't have arisen. Issues of ethics, issues of the structure of the interview, issues of how participants were recruited. I just want to start there, that it was more of a snowball kind of thing, where and yes, it's graduates and dropouts. It was a lot harder to trace down dropouts because they are outside of home. They were outside of the university, but it was much easier to trace graduates because most of them are continuing with their studies, masters, doctoral studies, and so they are actually on campus, and so it was much easier to locate them. I did not know a single one of them, because I think that was one of the questions. With regard to the methods part, particularly with regard to the narrative choice, I chose it specifically because I wanted to hear from the margins indeed, but I also wanted a fresh perspective. A lot of the master narratives I spoke to are mainly advanced by people from a particularly privileged and powerful position, whether it's in the media or it's in academia or in policy making cycles. Now, what the thesis does is that it puts the whole story there, so not bits of it, but rather organized according to different phases of their educational journey. So a section from their description of where they come from, a section on their journey, or what I call pathways into higher education, and a section on their entire higher education experience. And how this actually took place, just to give you an example, there were probably one or two questions. Tell me about yourself and your journey to and through higher education. And what are some of the key moments, nadir moments, high moments, turning points, and so on. So that was the structure of the interview, precisely because what I referred to as priority themes there is that once all the data was in place, I needed a way of representing the data in order to show what narrative researchers call temporal dimensions of the data. So that when you are reading it, you are able to see where the participant is in their educational journey. Of course, at the end, what I then do now is a cross-case kind of analysis to show how different points or themes are voiced by those in historically Black universities, by those in historically white universities. In other words, what seems to stand out? And as I said, in my view, there is no such thing as a theme that emerges out of data. A theme emerges out of the data and out of the interaction of the participant and the researcher. In other words, it's the core construction of theme and less of a theme that emerged and I thought I've just discovered something. In any case, that is at least the nature of qualitative inquiry. So yes, you raised an important point to say, why is it silent on Fees Must Fall? One is because of the character of the participants. You see, the study was started in 2015. In fact, I went to the UK in around September. Fees Must Fall started around October, November. But so the participants, if I'm looking at dropouts and I'm looking at graduates, it means in the main, these are people who had just completed their studies and considering going into honors or masters, and some were obviously not in the university at all. In the back of my mind, of course, I could see what was happening on campuses from the UK, and therefore I was able to see how this research does in some ways resonate to what was currently happening on campuses. And I think I take your point that further research should be able to interact with that reality, which I do in subsequent writings, but not this paper in particular. So yes, I've already stressed that the priority themes come after the narrative, not at the point of collection. And so indeed, the narrative was as raw as possible. Zara, I found your issue, your contribution just as helpful as Otilia's. Very helpful, particularly because you come to the conceptual issues around this thing we call poor and working class. And I'll come to this just now, but the reason why I stayed close to the NSFAS definition of poor and working class is precisely because I was trying to study NSFAS funded working class graduates and dropouts and their experiences of completion and non-completion. And you would have seen that in the thesis that I sent to you, I stress that this is not necessarily a definition of working class conceptually. However, because I'm trying to see the role or the limits and strength that financial aid is having in its attempt to transform access and success, I then stayed close to that. The limitations of that is that indeed it does exclude some of the things you so pointedly raise about the differences in working classness amongst the working class, white working class, mixed race working class, black working class, and so on. Also, working class at the very, by the time I was doing the research, the definition was still up to 122,000. Of course, it's now 350,000. So you are absolutely correct. At the time I was collecting my data, 2 security guards who are married and therefore earn 140,000 per annum were not considered poor and working class. And just to say, I completely agree with how the working class definition in South Africa needs to be problematized further. And the research you refer to is just as helpful. If you remember, Sahara, for 15 years, the definition of which poor and working class stayed the same, while the cost of living and the cost of studying tripled, if more than tripled during the same period. Now we have a new category called missing middle, which I'm still currently engaging critically, because I don't think there is such thing as a middle class in South Africa. But then, of course, we must debate what class is outside of the income spectrum. In fact, very important work has been done by Arup Kataji at Wits University, as well as Anna Othofer at Stellenbosch University. And the way they characterize the split of wealth and income in South Africa is just as is supportive of your analysis. But you ask an important question about whether I'm critiquing or extending Bordeaux, or do I see this work as a critiquing or extending Bordeaux? It's more of an extension of Bordeaux, illuminating the transformative potential in Bourdieu's theoretical constructs. That's one. But number two is a critique in how Bourdieu's theoretical tools have been used to advance a deficit outlook on this group of students. So your reflection on Bourdieu's theoretical tools, Zara, is absolutely spot on. I was more critical. In fact, Carmen Mills, the Australian researcher, has a whole paper on the transformative dimensions of Bourdieu's reproduction theory, and how, so issues of transformative habitus, issues of capital accumulation and conversion, which I didn't have enough time to go into. Because of time, I want to quickly go to Narim's question. Thank you for the compliment first, but also the question is just as important. How do you frame the possible complicity of institutions of higher learning, and what needs to be done to transform? As I think it's this is exactly where the research needs to go. One for me is that the first point I would recommend is the issue of revisiting contextual admissions. Contextual admissions, that is admission system that look beyond the national senior certificate. Why am I saying that? Well, I'm a Wits graduate whose matric results would not qualify to access Wits today. And then the narrower definition of who qualifies would say it's because I wouldn't have the potential to master or understand or survive and eventually graduate. So I would not qualify to access, despite the fact that I'm a graduate of the same university. So contextual admissions a discussion around contextual admissions would have to deal with such discrepancies in how we understand potential amongst young people, and how we punish young people in the name of individual merit before they even come into institutions of higher learning. Diversity, not just here, you would know, Narim, that in the UK, there's a Boris Johnson race report that's currently being debated, where indeed many, which shows rather that indeed many amongst ourselves in higher education research and in public policy making cycles remain reluctant to recognize race, one, as a legitimate object of scrutiny, and two, as having a role in how our institutions reproduce earlier and historic forms of domination. So indeed, therefore, I would recommend that universities begin to engage with race, or rather transformation, by looking at transforming institutional levers, as opposed of how institutions relate to Black working class students, as opposed to trying to convert these Black working class students into teachable or ideal students. In other words, trying to manufacture. My biggest contribution would be that universities need to be some kind of a forex exchange institution, which is able to recognize, you know, that ATM at the airport, which is able to recognize the value of almost every currency, regardless of where you're coming from in the world, and see value in whatever it is you bring. And I think the collective value of all students would enrich and not degrade the university and the quality of the offering. I hope I've done justice to the questions, but Narim, that question is indeed something which I think those of us working under the chair will be contending with moving forward, because I think it's particularly helpful. I hope I haven't left out anything, and I think because of time, I will pause there for now. And just to thank you for the questions again, and to thank the discussants once more.
Thanks, Mukovhe. I'm going to open up now for questions, but I'll just read some of the comments that have come. The one from Kirti Menon is, your research also requires us to revisit our pedagogical practices. From Leila, important to cover ethical issues with other groups. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll down quickly. The other was from Lauren, who says invaluable presentations for her, who was in an early part of her PhD journey. From Salim Badat, excellent presentations, and then from a colleague from Florida saying it reflects similar inequalities faced due to race and class in the US, from the University of Central Florida. Because we're a smaller group, because this is meant to. So Gert van der Westhuizen has a question, which is so many questions and insights. The point was made that class differences are also dominated with knowledge dominance and epistemic accents. How can cognitive justice be brought into higher education? That's one question, and the other is just a comment. But I wanted to ask, Palesa, is it possible, can participants ask questions themselves as well? Is that question open? Okay, great. So I'm going to ask while Mukovhe is preparing a response to some of the comments and questions. If any of you want to ask a question, please just open your mic, introduce yourself, and ask. We are a community of people who know each other quite well. And yeah, I was just going to ask that. I did want to ask, Prof Salim Badat did send me a comment on the little brief that we had sent out. And he had made a comment there about how we characterized what was under discussion. I'm not sure whether he's wants to just open his mic and add to his comment. Thanks very much. Or anybody else who wants to just add in and make a comment.
Sorry, Prof, there is a hand raised on the attendees. They can open their mic and ask.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sure. Please do that.
Hi, Prof. How are you?
Sure, fine. Yes.
Good. Thank you very much, Dr. Masutha, for the information that you have shared today. I've just got one question. You've mentioned that Oh, by the way, this is Vuyo,
Sure.
a postgraduate at TVETS and currently an audit trainee at BDO. But I just wanted to ask a question, Dr. Masutha. You mentioned that the definition of who's poor in South Africa has been measured with a figure of 110.20 for over 15 years. And post that now, the current definition we are using is 310.20. In your research of your doctorate from Bath, did you do a research or put parameters in place to say for how long will we use that definition of 310.20 in measuring who's poor and not poor in South Africa? And I'm asking this question because on a yearly basis, different companies in the private sector, they adjust the salaries of the people because the standard of living is changing on a yearly basis with the inflation rates changing. As a government, to be ahead of ourselves to make sure that no one is excluded to who qualifies for free education in the NSFAS platform. How long do you think we should continue using that 310.20 if you have not included that in your PhD? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Prof, should we wait for Prof Badat, or should I just respond?
I think, Prof Badat, just ask your question, just unmute and speak. Okay.
Okay. Thanks. Now I have a facility. It wasn't there earlier.
Okay.
So this was really a question of how we frame things. And I was really, it can be seen as a quibble, as I said to Shireen, but I don't think it's a quibble because I think it's very important how we frame things. So when we say in an opening sentence that higher education was tasked with a cycle of breaking the poverty cycle and so on, I really think we have to be careful about framing it that way. Because it's one thing to say that's what the task of higher education is, and quite a different thing to say that higher education has to help. Because I don't think, to be honest, higher education on its own or universities on their own can achieve some of the things that we seem to be expecting them to achieve in the context of a capitalist society. So, it's not a quibble in that sense. It's a big difference to say higher education must do this, or higher education must contribute, assist, help. Because ultimately, I think we'll accept, if we are progressive scholars, that it really depends on macroeconomic and social policies and so on, whether they create a conducive environment within which higher education can do some work, or it can't do some work. I mean, that's not a quibble. That's a major point in terms of how we frame it. Because otherwise, we must simply accept higher education cannot do that. And the interventions in learning and teaching cannot do some of the things we are expecting, because it is outside of the bounds of higher education. It has to do with nutrition. It has to do with early school education. It has to do a whole lot of things. So this is not an argument against extended programs or foundation programs or intervening and so on. And it's not an argument that our institutional cultures do not facilitate appropriate outcomes for students who come from working class and rural poor families and so on. So there are lots of things higher education can do, universities can do. But I really think we must start, all of us, becoming much more honest about our notions of transformation and what can and cannot be done while we exist within a capitalist society. Indeed. And that even when you look historically, and I think James Boulder has made this very profound point, and he made it in the 1960s. And I think there's a real research project here, that the majority of the students, whether they are black or white, no matter how well they've been educated or not been educated, by and large, plot in and reproduce capitalism, including the radicals of the 1980s. This is very pessimistic, I know, for people who are progressive. But I think we must start to come to grips with some of these issues, about how we set up higher education and universities and what we expect them to do in the context of a society that's not just capitalist, but neoliberal also. That's what I was trying to say. Please be careful of how we frame things, because otherwise you're setting up the universities for failure even before we've started, because we're not understanding the roles they can and they can't play in the context in which we work and live.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thanks very much.
Prof, should I go ahead?
Yes, I think you've got 3 questions. One from Prof Gert about social justice and cognitive justice.
Yes.
From the colleague from WITS, and now from Prof Badat. So do answer. In the meantime, if others can think about what they'd like to speak about. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I want to start at the end with Professor Badat to begin by agreeing with him before clarifying my framing of higher education, at least in this presentation. I want to start by agreeing that indeed that both education cannot compensate for societal flaws, one, and education is indeed not a panacea to all social ills facing South Africa or any country in the world. So we're in complete agreement there. What I am focused on, however, is interrogating the institutional context, knowing, or rather noting, the role higher education has played in the past in reproducing class and racial domination, and noting that education, of which higher education is a part, has been, at least within the context of the National Development Plan, the RDP, the White Paper of '97, and has been tasked with the role of contributing to redressing the legacy of apartheid and colonialism. Now, the legacy of apartheid and colonialism is a legacy of class exploitation, racial exploitation, and the subjugation of the Black majority. That is the legacy. Now, that is the task which has been given to higher education. Higher education can either contend with that particular responsibility and reframe the policy, or we can examine what about higher education in South Africa today prevents it from contributing to the supreme task that is being bestowed with, which is to redress parts of the past. It's certainly not to redress everything. There's so much about South Africa which is a legacy of the past, which higher education cannot do. But in this case, if I'm focusing on educational journeys of poor Black working class students, then that is very much within the purview and mandate of South African higher education. And we are interrogating experiences of completion and non-completion in South African higher education in its multiple status types of universities to see what is it about South African higher education is impacting negatively or positively in their odds of access and success. So I'm in complete agreement with you with regard to framing, but I thought I must just restate the framing in this case is that we are not framing it as a panacea to South African problems, but we are framing it as a sector that must change, one, in deciding who gets to be taught, how they are taught, how their success is understood and defined within the South African context, and not necessarily what is happening, where by June, faculties are excluding students who have failed to meet, say, a 50% pass rate in the School of Accounting Science at Wits University. But that is very much within the control of the university. It can decide what to and what not to do. That is what I'm speaking. I'm speaking about institutional practices of different universities in relation to this group of students. As for Vuyo, yes, you are absolutely correct. The definition of poor and working class is at the heart of how higher education has been funded, the differentiated manner in which it has been funded. Between NSFAS establishment and indeed December 2017, you were considered poor and working class if your family earned between 0 and 122,000. And this may deal with the issue of who is the underclass and who is not. So 0, that is people with 0 income, to people who earn up to 122,000. But to make things worse, it was not an individual income threshold. It was a household income threshold that is means tested. So that's an important thing to recognize. And then when it was then adapted to 350, it covered in theory, not in practice, in theory, at least those households which earn between 0 and 350,000. Now, my argument is that how higher education is funded must be based on principles of distributive justice, reparative justice, and social solidarity. What does that mean? Social solidarity simply means we all acknowledge that the wealth that South Africa currently sits on and South Africans currently sit on, in one way or another, was in the main made on the backs of the Black working class majority. And so higher education must be funded as a societal responsibility and not the responsibility of individual families or individual students. So how you then cap who qualifies for what kind of financing, that's the debate we can have. What we cannot have, the debate we cannot have, is that higher education be allowed to exclude some and accept some. On my view, I am an advocate of wealth tax. I am an advocate of increased corporate tax that extracts trillions out of our resources and export them outside. I believe those distributive or redistributive measures at the very top, and I know Arup adverts, the economist from National Treasury and his colleagues, they've just produced a very important working paper on the possibilities of a wealth tax in South Africa. And they show how just a little bit of a tax at the very top could generate almost amounts equivalent to 3 to 4% of total GDP. Just to give you an understanding of how much money that is, higher education pre-2017 at least was still funded below 1% of GDP. So indeed, in my view, it must be redistributive justice and social solidarity that guides us. Understanding that indeed there can be no future if that future is not shared. I hope I do justice to that. Then the last issue was on the issue of cognitive justice. Indeed, participants in some of this study did raise this issue of whose knowledge is considered knowledge, whose experience, whose knowledge is considered valid. And I think that in South Africa today, by virtue of our history, by virtue of what I call the past 27 years of a failed neoliberal experiment, we need to start asking that question honestly. And I think the person who asked it is therefore correct. I don't have an accurate answer on how I think institutions can begin to be just in that manner. But I think making sure that people who speak, I'm not advocating for a university that teaches 7 official languages. I don't think that is practical. But a higher education that in itself respects the fact that everybody comes with something that they offer to the institution, and it is the contribution of everybody that makes our institutions what they are. We can begin to make a step in the right direction. That's probably not the most exhaustive of answers, but that would be my 2 cents to that. And just to again thank the 3 questions, the 3 speakers who asked those questions as well, and to thank you for your contribution. Prof. I think Prof Mutala is still muted.
Sorry, I'm still muted. I see that Ahmed Isup has got a question. Ahmed, do you want to go ahead? Ahmed? You've got your hand up. Okay, he needs to be unmuted.
Okay.
Right, thanks. Palesa, can you unmute?
I'll unmute it. Can you hear? No.
Yes, we've heard you.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
we
you
can
know.
hear
Thank
now.
you.
I just wanted to follow up on this last point that Mukovhe made about epistemological knowledge, whose knowledge is taught, and so forth. And what I find completely baffling or perplexing is in 2015, the student protest that started at the historically white universities at UCT and it's focusing on hashtag Rhodes Must Fall, decolonization of higher education and so forth.
Mm.
But it very quickly muted into a focus on fees must fall. And post 2015, the whole issue of transforming, of decolonizing the curriculum, etc., from the point of view of the student movement has fallen away.
Mm.
So is it that they're really only interested in a sense, in a material sense, and I'm not arguing that that's a problem,
Sure.
about money,
Mm.
and how would you explain that Rhodes Must Fall and the calls for the demand for decolonization did not really gain traction in the historically Black universities?
Mm.
And I'm sure you're not going to argue that those universities are transformed as we speak now. So how do you explain these contradictions in the way students understand what higher education should or should not be doing?
All right. Thank
Can I-
Ahmed.
Yeah,
Is there another question, Prof?
Well, I just wanted to add to that question. I think that one of the things as a system that we're missing in our analysis is just about the issue of differentiation and
Yeah.
how differentiated the higher education system continues to be. And often our solutions are a one size fits all.
Yes.
And what is quite counterintuitive in our setting is, for example, who gets access to what so-called perceived to be high-quality university are actually students because they meet the criteria, except for the funding formula, which allows, for access for other students. Having said that, the issues of access and increasing participation from a policy context and from an equity perspective are actually important. I think what you're pointing to, which is really worrisome, is the issue of completion, dropout, push out, whatever. But I think let's return to Ahmed Isup's question. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Ahmed, for the question. Just to say that your observation is spot on. Now, obviously, I'm a rural fellow, so I'm from Venda. I'm able to who studied in the traditionally white universities in the city. So I have a little bit of experience, but it won't be a representative response. It will just be based on one's lived experiences and observation. So limited in that way. But yes, you are correct that. So what I think happened is that I have protested in universities against the commodification of higher education and the privatization of public spaces and buildings in and around higher education since 2007. So by the time I was joining my first protest, fees must fall protesters were still in primary school. And by the time I was president of VETS, they were still in high school. And my observation from that point of view is that in the rural universities, in many ways, we are just trying to get by. We're just trying to remain in higher education. It's more of a survivalist kind of space. After all, many of us are ending up there after being rejected by traditionally white universities because of the differences in entrance requirements. And so the character of the students and the nature of the issues at the University of Venda is 5 students squatting in dilapidating conditions. At Men's Hall of Residence at VETS, which is almost 90 years where I lived, I have so much space by myself. I'm not so concerned about the guy whose feet is over my face or the fact that the hot plate might burn all of us down because we are cooking where we are sleeping and so on. And so there is that difference in privilege in that sense. It's a very differentiated academic or institutional context. So it's only now, I think, that students who used to say, I will not join the protest, if you are poor, just don't come to the university. Given the rapid nature with which the cost of living and studying has been rising, even those who were perceived as middle class began to feel the pinch. It was inevitable anyway, in my view, for Rhodes Must Fall to transform into Fees Must Fall, because Fees Must Fall protests, even though they were not called Fees Must Fall then, were always very seasonal, around the time when universities make adjustments on how they want, by how much they want to raise their fees. So I don't read too much into Rhodes Must Fall turning into Fees Must Fall. I read a lot in the conversation about decolonization dying down after some kind of stability is restored on fees. And that's where your point comes in. I think the conversation on decolonization needs to be thrown back to universities. I can't explain why it has died down, to be honest. I would be trying to really pull my tooth out if I try to give a direct answer to that. What I can say, however, is that you have students differentiate, as much as we have differentiated institutions by status, we also have differentiated students, student categories of students. And I think as a result of that, the issues that matter are very different, as Professor Motala has stressed. Oh, let me not say matter, because that's too deterministic. The things that are agents, matters that are agents, would be food, would be having stable accommodation, would be making sure that you don't fail. I always tell policymakers that if you think you can police protests, you are really mistaken. The only thing that is capable of stopping protests is exam timetables being published, because we know that if you fail the exams, you won't be a student next year. So protesters can never be quelled by police. The securitization of protests is actually not only backward and counterproductive, but it's out of ignorance, at least on the part of the securocrats, on how to manage dissent within higher education institutions. So I think the fact that different students have different immediate concerns across different types of universities can hopefully, I think, explain why some issues are more pronounced in other universities and others are not. Of course, you have extreme things where students get shot in public, which is obviously an issue that is completely recognized as problematic across the student population. And then you have a media that is mainstream. So if Univen or Ongoye is burning, you won't hear much of it, or at least it won't be on primetime news. But if somebody breaks their toe somewhere near Jan Smart's Avenue, then it will be breaking news. And I think the manner in which some universities are treated as equal, while some are more equal than others, explain which narratives get to be told or pronounced and which ones are kind of swept behind under the carpet, and then we move on as normal. Of course, things can never really be normal for as long as experiences in higher education are unequal amongst different groups of students and, of course, different institutions. There is a. Oh yeah, I think that was the last that was the last question. Unless if I'm missing something, Prof.
Thanks very much, Mukovhe. I'm going to ask finally for any last contributions, questions, comments. I can't see any. I can't see any. I just want to ask, I'm going to make just a concluding comment, but I did want to ask Zahra and Ottilia if they wanted to just come in, or anybody else for that matter. Zahra, Ottilia, you want to have a last word? Zahra?
Yeah, I mean, I think thanks again, Mukovhe. I think, you know, in answering the different questions, both from Ottilia and I, and also from the other participants, we really got a lot more from the presentation. So thanks very much for your responses. And I think I do just want to perhaps go back to what Salim Badat was saying about, you know, what we're expecting from higher education. And in a sense, how Mukovhe is saying this is framed, you know, policy and sort of public discourse does frame higher education as this panacea, as even though we understand that it's not, we understand perhaps that it can't be, but the manner in which it is framed, for example, in the NDP, in lots of other policy documents, and higher education as the sort of epitome of education, but education sort of more broadly speaking, the suggestion in policy is that the more we educate, the better we will be. And yet, you know, is that really happening? And so, in as much as we don't want to expect things from higher education institutions that we shouldn't, they also then need to be upfront about it and say that actually we can't. Don't say that we can. Don't presume that the more we educate, the better the country will be. It is really, we really need to ask what we are doing and to interrogate the symbolic violence, and to realize that, and also higher education institutions have to accept their privilege.
Yes.
You know, and they get to do whatever they want to do necessarily. WITS, for example, is one of the few institutions that charge an application fee. So let's forget about the entry requirements.
Yeah.
But an application fee, which perhaps to some is nothing, 100 rand.
Yeah.
But if we go back to consider that, you know, 10% of the population is only earning 1% of the income in this country, then we have to ask who can even make the application, even if they, you know, they reach the entry requirement. So I think we have to have, I think, maybe a broader conversation about how higher education understands this notion of public good and what they are doing, and how they are contributing to reproducing particular class positions and positioning.
Correct.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Zahra. Ottilia, over to you for a minute or two.
Thank you so much, Mukovhe. That was an interesting presentation, and thanks for answering the questions. I don't have anything else to ask, but only to say all the best as you work on your paper and you continue with your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ottilia.
Thanks, Ottilia. Let me just then conclude before everybody goes, just to make a few comments. I think the presentation today has been fascinating. I think it's also asked a lot of hard questions that we often don't want to consider. And while I know Mukovhe is now a PDRF, I think it also brings an intergenerational difference, that he's asking questions that maybe I may not be asking or not understanding. So I think that perspective he brings, which comes from his student days, both in Johannesburg and then further on, are very useful. I think there are a number of things, just 3 or 4 things that he raised, which are really important. And thanks also to Ottilia and Zahra for their interesting and sometimes posing the difficult questions, both from a research and theoretical perspective, from a methodological perspective, etc. But I think the big things take homes for me is that what you raised very clearly was the issues of exclusion and inclusion in South African society. And in some ways that bifurcation, you know, carries through from schooling, through to higher education, through to the PSET sector. And I think what we haven't discussed today is what meaningful opportunities does the schooling sector and the school leaving exam provide in terms of just accessing post-school opportunities. And I think that is a big gap from a policy perspective in our sector. I sit on Umalusi, and I've sat on the ministerial committee for the senior certificate, and really what you can do with a higher education certificate is in fact very little, or almost nothing. So when we see those wonderful matric statistics at the end of the year, they need to be thought a lot more. So I think it is about inclusion, exclusion. I think the next point is the point that Prof Badat made, was about the relationship between social equity and education equity. And I remember years ago when we did the work on school fees and schools, we raised the point that while we are now in an era of no fee schools, and we are in an era of partially no fees in universities, in fact the societal sections, societal conditions don't change. And with schooling, we were raising the same issues that he's raising. It's around issues, it's around access to psychological services, it's around rural divides. Those are really big questions. And in some ways, the two, there has to be some alignment between social development and education development. Otherwise, we will never succeed. I think the last issue was about I think, and that's underlying the policy discussions that are happening at the moment, both across schooling and higher education sectors, are our funding mechanisms for equity, both in schooling and higher education, actually flawed? And I think I have raised, particularly with my colleague Firoz Patel, who passed away a few years ago, was maybe it's time to relook, for example, the quintile system in school. Actually meaningless at the moment because schooling has changed such a lot. It's actually no fee schools, is different from what we expected 10 years ago. So what I have argued in some of my other work is we need a much more nuanced understanding of equity and inequality in the South African system. And Zahra raised it in terms of trying to think through a nuancing class. Mukovhe is raising it in terms of the narrative experiences, have raised it in different sorts of ways. So I just want to say, conclude by saying, Mukovhe, do you have an absolutely last word that you would like to have at this point?
It's just thanks, because to have people like Salim Badat in my presentation, it's unreal. So just to thank everyone, I've gone through the list of participants, and I've seen names that I wouldn't expect to be in my seminar. So I'm privileged to be part of this PDRF. I'm privileged to be under your guidance, Prof Motala, under the chair. I'm privileged that colleagues took their time to listen to this work. I want to acknowledge and thank Professor Rajani Naidoo, with whom I did the doctorate, and out of which this work flows from. A lot needs to be updated, since the sector has changed so much, since I started, between when I started the doctorate and now. And I want to thank the discussants really and I cannot wait to come home so that we can sit around our PDRF offices and still, hopefully, public health allowing, continue to build on this work and other works that Ottilia and Zara are working on. And to thank you, Prof, for making this happen.
Thanks very much. So again, I want to thank all the participants today, and I really am grateful. This was our first chair formal seminar. I want to thank the PDRFs for putting themselves out there and making themselves visible. So I'm very grateful for that, to my colleagues from the Ali Mazrui Center, to everybody here. I see Carol is here, Gert, Salim, Thea, a whole range of colleagues, Thomas from SAChi, etc. So thanks very much to all the colleagues. I want to just conclude with 3 announcements. The first is that there was a missing voice today. If Michael was here, we would have had to extend by 10 minutes.
Yes.
We had a whole set of observations, very critical observations, Mukovhe, on what you said, which would help take the discussion forward. For me, he is a missing voice at this first seminar that we've had. The second is that the memorial for Michael Cross is on Friday at 2:00. I hope you've received the invite. If you haven't, send me a message and I will forward you the invite, or Reshmi or Zahra will do that. And finally, an advert. We have our next seminar on the 26th of July for the Chair Seminar Series. It's on the Future Focused University, and the presenter will be Ahmed Issop from the Ali Mazrui Center. He has got a paper ready, which will be available, summary of which for distribution. So thank you all. Thanks to Mukovhe. I know it's very early in the morning in Canada. So good morning to you. Thanks to all the colleagues. Please stay safe, and hopefully we'll meet again in other fora. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Zara and Ottilia.
Everybody.